There's one particular aspect of working with EQ that's potentially a bit of a minefield: low frequencies. Thanks to the realities of room acoustics and speaker response, most of us can't always trust our monitoring environment to provide a 100% accurate picture of what's going on in the bass, below around 200 or 300 Hz. And this can have disastrous results when we rely on that environment to make EQ decisions in the low frequency range. In fact, low-end issues are maybe the most common problem with mixes that come out of smaller project rooms and personal studios. When the monitoring provides a false picture of the bass, you may be tempted to add or remove low-end at certain frequencies until things sound right on that system. But you may be compensating for problems that only exist in that one location. When the mix is played on other systems in other rooms, they won't share those problems or that specific response, and it's likely the EQ you've applied will make the mix sound worse rather than better. The goal is to apply EQ that will travel well, which means it'll sound good in any listening environment. And to do that, you have to either have a neutral sounding system or be very familiar with the actual sound of your own system, including any flaws, so you won't be tripped up. There are a number of reasons why the monitoring environment, speakers and room, may not provide an accurate enough picture of what's actually going on in the bass area of recordings and mixes. The speaker's bass response is a function of size and design. Smaller monitors will be lacking in frequencies below a certain point, depending mostly on woofer size. With an 8-inch or larger woofer, you can probably get sufficient response down to around 50 Hz or so. But the 6-inch, 5-inch, and 4-inch woofers you find in many desktop speaker models will roll off the low end much higher, somewhere between around 60 and 100 Hz. This can lead to the temptation to push the bass at the lowest remaining frequencies those systems provide. But on other larger speakers, this will often result in way too much boomy low end, which may tend to mask other aspects of the mix, seriously reducing overall clarity. On the other hand, some consumer speakers may add this bass bump themselves to compensate for the missing low end extension, or a speaker placement against a wall, or worse, in a corner, will overemphasize certain bass frequencies. When you cut to compensate, the mix ends up sounding thin and weak on any systems that don't share that specific bass bump. The room itself will also likely have uneven bass response. Due to the specific size and shape of a room and the relative wavelengths of bass frequencies, room modes, or standing waves, will form in any space with parallel walls or surfaces. At different locations within the room, certain low frequencies, ones whose wavelengths correspond to room dimensions, will be strongly emphasized in some places and canceled out in others. These modes can be tamed with acoustic treatments, but making a room's bass response truly even, like commercial studios, could be expensive and difficult to implement without construction and a significant loss of usable space. Commercial wall and corner treatments are available, but most smaller budget-conscious studios will have to live with room modes to some degree. This doesn't mean you can't work in those spaces, but you need to get to know the room's flaws and quirks so they won't trip you up. With a little help from books and articles, Google Studio Acoustics and Standing Waves, you can map out where the worst of these uneven spots are located and arrange speaker and monitoring positions to avoid them. Typically, freestanding speakers, at least a foot or two from the nearest walls or floor, may have slightly less bass, but the bass will be more accurate. A monitoring position, where the engineer sits to mix, the sweet spot, should be about 4 feet or so from the back wall in a typical small room. And you should always check the mix, both as you go and when it's finished, on different speakers in different rooms, as well as on various headphones, to look for any problems that don't show up in the primary mix room. In front of the DAW itself, be particularly wary of any large, narrow boosts or cuts you find yourself making in the frequency range below 200 Hz. While these may be needed to fix issues in the recordings themselves, it's equally likely they may be in response to a room issue, in which case you won't want to do them. Small, wide, overall low-end tweaks of a dB or two are probably fine and will translate or travel well, but you still want to check the low end on as many systems as possible. You also want to know what your main monitoring environment sounds like on a wide range of commercial recordings, so you know what aspects of the bass should be fixed and which should be left alone. Like I said, it can be a bit of a minefield, but once you get to know the specifics of your primary monitoring environment, warts and all, you should be able to mix and tweak the bass with a reasonable degree of confidence.